If you would ask me what my favorite game of all time is, I would probably tell you it's a little old MMORPG called Ragnarok Online. Yes, I'm old. Released back in 2002 or 3 depending where you're from, this game would be the reason why gaming would be a huge part of my life and why I was failing at school. In the world of MMORPGs back in the day, the West had games like World of Warcraft, while here in the East, we had Ragnarok Online, and many more actually. It was developed by a studio called Gravity Interactive, but instead of publishing it themselves, instead sold the right to publish the games to other companies depending on the country. They would sell them patches and updates for the game, a unique method of doing things that would bite them in the ass but ultimately be profitable for them. Although it would come with its own slew of issues, and believe me, there were a ton of issues, especially during launch. Despite this, the game did release to critical success, at least in my country. Everyone was playing it. Net cafes would be filled to the brim with Ragnarok Online players, and at school, it's all people talked about. They would talk strategies, the levels they've reached while grinding over the weekend, rare item drops, and the occasional begging for Zenny, the in-game currency. Suffice to say, the game was extremely popular in the East. I myself have put at least 10,000 hours into the game, but with some caveats. We'll get into that later on. Now, despite the game being a paid subscription model, they actually did something that is quite genius. In some countries, they offered time cards in very cheap prices that would be affordable even to kids, with the cheapest one being up to 10 cents for an hour of gameplay to $1 for 8 hours of gameplay, and even up to $5 for a month of gameplay. This is actually pretty smart because as a kid, I would just spend my allowance on time cards in order to play RO in addition to the net cafe costs. This means I didn't even need to ask my parents about borrowing their credit card in order to pay for a subscription or anything like that. I could just pop in my local convenience store, use my allowance to buy a time card, and pay for the subscription for how many hours I would be playing. Pretty genius if you think about it. And this method of paying subscription would attract a lot of kids that didn't need to ask their parents for anything, and they would be able to play Ragnarok Online. But just what is it about Ragnarok that made it stand out from the rest of its competitors at the time? Good gameplay? Well, it was decent for the time, but not really stand out as it was very similar to other games at the time. Good graphics? Yes, actually. That is one thing. The sprite work is actually insanely good, as while other games focused on 3D graphics and trying to make that look good, RO focused on 2D sprites in a 3D environment, ensuring that it looks good and ages well. And to be honest, it still looks good today. Is that what made it better than other MMOs though? Not really. Perhaps it was the story. Not exactly. In fact, if you ask any Ragnarok player what the story of the game is, I guarantee that most RO players will tell you that there isn't really a story. While there is lore, there isn't really a personal story that binds your character to the world itself, or any personal story for that matter. You simply get dropped into the world and you grind monsters for levels and gear. That's pretty much it. No, the most standout thing of Ragnarok at the time was the social aspect of the game. Now, while all MMOs have a social aspect to it, especially back in 2003, Ragnarok 2 would stand out in this aspect, as many of the game's content was significantly easier with a party. And believe me, back in the day, Ragnarok was not easy. Dying in the game would incur XP penalties, reviving doesn't regenerate your HP and SP, which means you would have to sit idle for a while to regenerate. Potions were expensive, and the worst part is XP rates were abysmal. So gathering a party eases all of that. That said though, the difficulty and the grind of the game isn't just part of the game. You could even say that it is the game itself. Unlike today's games where the end game is where everything is at, back in the days of RO, the journey was the game itself. Leveling from level 1 to 99 would take you to a lot of places in the world, provided you weren't an acolyte or a mage, that is. And it would take a significant portion of your time in the game. And slowly seeing your character grow as well as your gear get better is pretty much the game itself. Don't get me wrong though, once you reach level 99 there was still a lot of things that you could do, as certain dungeons in the game did require a max level party to completely clear. However, the journey to 99 was basically the game itself. This was also because leveling was quite satisfying. Even though XP rates were abysmal, especially in 1x, the satisfaction that you would get when you leveled enough and you were able to advance your job class, it's pretty addicting. Which is why, despite taking a long time, many people had alts, and many people even enjoyed just leveling in the game and creating each job. That's also just the base leveling. The gearing and building of the character gets way more in depth. Let's talk about that a little bit. You basically start the game as a novice, and eventually you level up to get a job. Back then, there were only a few jobs to choose from: swordsman, merchant, thief, mage, acolyte, and archer, each with its own unique playstyle, and each job had a different form of quest or test to be able to become that job. So even as a novice, you had to think about these job changes and how difficult they may be. For example, with thieves, you would have to duck and dodge enemies in a pyramid where they could and would one-shot you to reach the thieves' hideout, then stealing some mushrooms off a farm so that you could prove that you are capable of becoming a thief. Which is a lot different than an acolyte, which would have you go on a pilgrimage to a foreign monastery in order to achieve an understanding of the gods of the world in order to devote yourself to them. The job quests were interesting, albeit sometimes frustrating, as some of them were difficult for certain classes to do. Luckily, there was a lot of players back then, so it wasn't hard to find someone who was also on the quest. And the classes themselves are diverse enough that they can be played a lot of different ways, like having a battle priest instead of a full support priest. Eventually, these classes evolved into alternate classes and transcendent classes to third jobs and currently fourth jobs, and I heard there are more down the pipeline. The process of leveling is quite an adventure in of itself, and involves a lot of grinding and gearing all the way to max level. This is all supported by the RPG system of Ragnarok Online, and to say that the RPG system of RO is deep is an understatement, especially how it's evolved today. I mean, just look at this. Although pre-Renewal wasn't as complicated as Renewal, there was still a lot of information that you needed to know in order to build your character as effectively as possible. The problem though was the internet isn't quite like it is today. Information about the game wasn't readily available, and well, the game doesn't really do a good job telling you on what you should do in order to help your class. So while guides were present at the time, it was hard to find a guide for the class you play, as most information about it is either vague, unreliable, or just plain wrong. You only get a general idea of how to build your character. Like if you were a thief, then your character would love agi and strength, while a mage class would like int and dex. It's not the same level of guides we have today where you basically follow a step-by-step guide and everything is explained, all the formulas are there. At the time, you basically had to build your character blind. They even released multiple guidebooks just to explain the systems of the game, so information was quite difficult to get, and technically it was paywalled by the guidebooks. Well, to be honest, this wasn't entirely a bad thing. I would even say it was a good thing, because now you had to ask other players who might know what they were doing to help you build your character, which invited a strong social atmosphere. Oftentimes in school, we would even converge on that one guy who had the guidebook and just read out the guidebook in order to learn about the game. And once you actually learn the stat system in the game, it was actually quite satisfying to be able to build your character in the most min-max way possible. RO is like a min-maxer's paradise. The only problem is getting the stuff you need. Back then, there were no shopping boards or world chat. Forums were also quite unreliable, so most of the time, if you needed something, you'd farm for it. Or my preferred method, you'd spend quite some time walking around town, opening various player shops to see if you could find anything that you needed. Then, more likely, the price would be set ludicrously high, so you'd have to haggle with the vendor in order to buy it. It was inefficient and time-consuming, but it was fun. These days, in modern MMOs and well, even the current version of RO, you would simply open a market board and search for the item you needed, then all the options would appear, you'd choose the cheapest one and buy it, completely removing any social aspect of bartering in the game. Gearing was also socially inclined back then, as some of the best items could be crafted if you were a blacksmith. It also had a hilarious name like a very strong fire stiletto or something like that. These were great items for leveling, however, there were also strong items dropped by monsters, but at very low rates. So whenever a monster dropped an item, oftentimes it could be something good. But the pinnacle of gearing are in cards. Monster cards give powerful buffs that can be attached to slotted armor or weapons. For example, a Fen card would allow you to continue casting a spell despite being hit. This was considered one of the most powerful cards back in the day. However, the caveat of cards is that they were exceedingly rare, having only a drop chance of 0.01%, which is lower than most 5-star gacha rates today. Not to mention, once a card has been slotted into an equipment, there was no way of getting them back, at least back in the day. But despite their rarity, they were still quite abundant because of the number of players that were, well, farming monsters in order to level up, so cards would drop just by the sheer number of monsters killed. So while cards were rare, they were kind of essential. And once a card has been slotted into an equipment, there was no way of getting them back. At least not back in the day. Thus, there was a lot of thought put into which equipment would be best for the card to be slotted into, and slotting it would be quite a commitment, as the value may drop because maybe the item is not good for certain classes and stuff like that. Oh, and speaking of which, a feature that's no longer in almost any modern MMO is being able to sell or trade items you've outgrown. Today's MMOs are almost always either having soul-bound or account-bound items, especially equipment. But RO back then and even today doesn't have much of this. So the old weapons or equipment that you used at level 40 could still sell after you reach level 60 once you find a better weapon for it. And it'll still be as good as new for the next player, which is why, again, it is very important to socialize with other players in the game. And what better way to do this than a guild? Guilds are basically the same as current MMOs, not much has really changed. It's a collection of players who banded together to create their own organization. Being in a guild came with a lot of perks, as most serious guild leaders would help newer players level and build their characters. Guilds also have a 50-person limit back in the day, so slots are precious and a lot of people would even have to pass interviews to get into the top guilds in the server. Now, this isn't just for clout or anything like that, no. In RO, guilds are also formed for the purpose of competing in the War of Imperium, which is like their guild wars. Back in the day, this war would occur twice a week on a schedule, and it would be a spectacle of hundreds of players fighting over a base they called an agit. And the rewards for winning a war weren't small. Top guilds would have access to rare items for winning the war consistently. And oftentimes, other guilds would have to band together in order to take down a top guild. Now, the war would essentially go like this. A guild who owned a base would have to defend that base from any other guild that tries to take it. Before the war begins, the base owners can set up their players in a defensive position around the base. Meaning they could be on top of walls raining down arrows or spells. You could have parties that hold the front lines, or archers set up traps. They could even summon NPC guardians to fight for them, all to defend the base's core, which is known as the Imperium. Once the war begins, players from other guilds can rush in and attempt to move through the long winding roads of the base to reach the Imperium and break it, all the while fighting the guilds that owns the base and other guilds that are also trying to take it. Overall, it's a clusterfuck of hundreds of players, and only the best and most organized guilds would have a chance of victory. There were even guilds that would reserve entire net cafes for the purpose of doing War of Imperium. Like I said, this was a huge deal, as winners of the war would have access to a private dungeon where loots and mini-bosses can be farmed, as well as a treasure chest to open every week they hold the base. The items found in these treasure chests can be used to create god items. This would boost the power of a player in that guild and propel their progress much further. This stuff can go deep into politics as well, as sometimes guilds would band together to take on a single base, or hire mercenary guilds to fight for them, where if the mercenary guild takes over the base, they'll hand it over to their clients before the end of the war. Not only that, but there are even specialized builds for players who build their characters for the sole purpose of being relevant to the war. Something like Breaker Assassins and Breaker Knights, whose sole build and items is to be optimized in destroying Imperiums as fast as possible. Then you have Professional E-Callers or Emergency Callers, being a skill that is accessible to the guild leader, allowing them to summon the entire guild into the base on their position. This has a long cooldown though, so some players would dedicate their entire skill set and stats into defense and making sure that they can stay alive, and into slipping behind enemy lines through means of stealth or high defense in order to perform the emergency call deep within the base for a surprise attack. There are many more examples of how players can build their character specifically to be more effective in this war. You could even build up a reputation for being good at those tasks and offer your services to the highest bidder. One of my core memories of the game was finding this MVP card that only I had in the entire server, which made my character a powerful force for the War of Imperium, which means a lot of guilds were offering salaries to me in order for me to join them in that particular day for the War of Imperium. There were groups of people that were serious in getting good at PvP and War of Imperium, because the game also incentivized it through, well, esports. Yeah, Ragnarok had esports back then and still actually exists in a smaller form today. Back then it was called the RWC, Ragnarok World Championships, and through that many countries would fight against each other in a guild versus guild or party versus party format. It was interesting what party compositions people would come up with in order to win. It used to be a big event back then that was featured in live streams and even television for some countries, and it lasted a decade in yearly competitions, which is just another example of how big RO was back then. Now, I did quit playing RO just before they introduced Renewal, I think around 2010. But let's talk about the 10,000 hours that I experienced in the game that I mentioned had some caveats. Well, those caveats being not all of those 10,000 hours were spent on the official servers. In fact, I'd say only about 30% of that time was actually spent on the official servers of the game, which is still a lot. But instead, a lot of those times were spent on private servers, most of which are gone now. Private servers, as weird as it is also a true experience of RO. I bet you every player has at least tried to play a private server, and there's a reason for that. Private servers fix the problems that the official server has or the problems that they themselves put, or at least people think is a problem. Examples of these are the max level, XP rates. 1x XP rates are extremely slow and it would take literal months to reach max level, and if you make a mistake in the build of your character, you will have to do it all over again, as stat and skill resets didn't exist before. Well, they kinda sorta existed once the cash shop was introduced. These were all problems that private servers fixed by increasing the max level to 255, for example, if that was more your thing, because it could unlock the full potential of a character. More on that later. And some servers even tripled or quadrupled the XP, which is counterintuitive to what I said earlier about leveling being the game. But I'll explain a little more on why these private servers chose the end game rather than the leveling experience. And there was also a ton of private servers, in the hundreds. But despite these, none of these private servers would overtake the official servers, mostly due to the fact that those private servers could simply close down at any time. However, there are these rare private servers that actually did flourish. I played on one such server for years. Servers that flourish like this often have a twist to them that would make them more appealing than the official server. And the server I played on skipped the whole leveling process. I think the XP rates at the time were like 100x, but what they offered was open world PvP. So at any time in the open world, you could fight other people and other players could fight you. This added a whole new dynamic to the world, as if you needed to farm a certain item or a certain card, you would have other players to contend with, and you could easily kill them or they could kill you. And this is the reason why they skipped the whole leveling process to begin with, because, well, if everybody was leveling very slowly, you could probably just get killed by the higher level players pretty easily and would eventually cause you to quit. Instead, the appeal was getting to max level, getting a decent amount of gear, and hunting for good gear or MVPs, which are the bosses in the game, while also fighting other players who are also trying to hunt the same bosses as you. So usually parties or guilds would party up, go to the area of the boss, and there would be huge battles over the boss, and whoever kills the boss first has the chance of getting the rare loots, as here items were auto-looted. So if you killed the boss or you did the highest damage to the boss, you would automatically get all the items. Guilds and other parties would also, instead of hanging out in towns, would hang out in certain places in the world that had cool areas and stuff like that. But since it's outside of town, it would still be a PvP enabled area. So other players could say they have a beef with this particular party, they would crash their area and start a war and just start killing people in that area, which would build another level of social dynamic in the game. I don't know, I might be remembering it with rose tinted glasses because explaining it sounds a little more different than how I remember it, but it was pretty cool at the time. These changing of the rules made some private servers extremely popular, garnering thousands of players, though never really reaching the height of the official servers, mostly due to private servers also being far behind in updates, and of course what I said earlier, it could just shut down at any time. The official servers of Ragnarok have a long history of updates, and updates back then were pretty frequent, enough that it kept players engaged, at least at the start. Although this also depended on the publisher of the server you were playing on at the time, as while Gravity would update the game, it was up to the publisher whether they'd buy that update and add it to the game itself. Updates would include new towns, new monsters, new equipment, new cards, the mail system, some balance changes, and even some events. Specifically holiday events. There's a whole town that's based off Christmas. Speaking of towns, the cities in Rune Midgard are amazingly made, Frontera being the most iconic, but the other towns look excellent too, like Pion, Morok. A lot of players would take a liking to a certain town and they would make that their home base. So back in the day, almost every town has players in it, even more so with the inclusion of their global map project, which added maps that are themed to certain countries, like Amatsu for Japan, Luoyang for China, Ayutthaya for Thailand, and many more. Not only that, they also added more base classes to coincide with these towns, in the form of the Taekwon, Ninja, and the Gunslinger for Einbrock, all of which got expanded jobs eventually. A lot of the updates would include new content as well, like an expanded team-based PvP in Battlegrounds, memorial dungeons like Endless Tower, new high-level dungeons, and a world story event with the introduction of Satan Morok, which changed whole zones as they were destroyed in a catastrophe in the summoning of this boss. They even changed the main city of Morok for a time. Invasion events even happened there and players had to defend the city against monsters. If you were a player back then, the grind would usually take up a lot of your time, so looking back at it, the update cadence didn't really feel that long. But in reality, the updates were far apart and many players had already started losing interest when their episodic updates slowed down. Because before there were 2 or 3 episode updates in a year, but they eventually went down to 1 and eventually even split that 1 into 3 minor updates. This led to a significant drop in the player base, especially since, as mentioned before, player bases were divided per country. So even though globally there were a lot of players, this wasn't true for every server. It was at this point around 2008 that some servers like India and Vietnam were struggling. Their player bases were dropping due to rampant RMT or real money trading and lack of updates and failsafes. They would eventually shut down and be revived by other publishers in the country wanting to scoop up those MMO refugees. Then the Renewal update came. In around 2010-2011, they dropped the Renewal update, a near total overhaul to the game's systems. Almost everything was changed. Stats were changed, skill effects were changed, the leveling method was changed, XP gain was changed, monster limits were implemented, and many more mechanics were changed. While marketed as a revival of the game, this was more of an attempt to make it more palatable to solo play due to dwindling numbers. The biggest change though was with the stats and computation of damage. The game introduced a lot more complex computations for skills and damage, which means gear that was good before may not be good anymore, which of course did not sit right with many players. Since their hard-earned gear, which has been relevant for a long time, especially cards, were now invalidated due to, well, what many perceived as unneeded changes. Though, I will say that a lot of players were also excited for the change, but many more were left disappointed. This update decimated the already dwindling player base and forced many others to seek games or other servers. This brought out a rise of pre-renewal private servers or servers that didn't adopt the renewal system. Due to this, there was a boom in the private servers, as this would be the time that some private servers would actually overtake the official servers in concurrent players, although most of those private servers are gone now. In all honesty though, Renewal wasn't that bad. It gave an almost decade-old game at the time a much-needed revamp, and after players have figured out the new changes, people were essentially fine with it, even though it was complex as hell. Just look at these formulas. But that's because these weren't the only changes to the game. The Renewal update added a lot more than just base mechanic changes. They added a little more depth to the story, they added things that would help new players get into the game like the Eden group, and many more. Although I wasn't there during the time when they released this patch, as I already had quit the game, which is why now I decided I should look at it. I should check out the current version of Ragnarok Online. And yes, Ragnarok Online is still alive, and considering its age, is still doing pretty well, especially in certain servers like the Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau servers still having 20,000 concurrent players. And across all of its servers, it still has around 50,000 players playing the game. Surprisingly, the updates also have not stopped. and if you look at the list of updates the game has received thus far, it's pretty long. So I decided to try out the international server of Ragnarok Online, also known as IRO. The first thing that stood out to me is the fact that the new player zone has changed. Previously, you would start in a novice zone. Now you start on a ship that is sailing towards Islud, one of the cities in the game. In addition, there is now somewhat of a story here. One of the most lacking things in the game 2 decades ago was, well, the lack of story. And now they introduced the Eden Group into the game. The Eden Group being a sort of adventurers guild within the game. Their main job is to help new players catch up by giving quests and equipment, as well as assisting players move throughout the game. Changing jobs is also much easier now as you basically skip the novice gameplay. It takes roughly 30 minutes if you skip dialogue to get out of the novice class and straight into first job. Back then it would take a few hours to do that. Quests now also play a heavy part in the game. Back then you pretty much just grinded monsters, but now bounties exist to complement your monster farming as well as show you which monsters you should be hunting down. Not to mention they give hefty XP rewards, and the Eden bounties provide useful starter items to help you on your journey. While all this is helpful, they do take away from the party mentality that the game once had, and now promotes a more solo style play, which is understandable considering that there's only like 1,500 concurrent players and like probably 95% of those players aren't leveling anymore. But it does take away from the beauty of the game. Now, I rolled a thief job, which eventually became an assassin, then assassin cross, then guillotine cross, and lastly, the new 4th job, shadow cross. Level 1 to 99, oddly enough, was pretty much the same as the old RO. But once I hit level 100, that's when the game gets real. That's right, level 99 is no longer the end of the game. The max level currently I think is 240, but it'll get expanded on in future updates. I think for the most latest patch it's 275 already, which is already a level that surpasses most private servers back in the day, as in private servers before the max level was 255. So now the official servers are going beyond that even. Anyway, as I was saying, at level 99, once you've passed your transcendent stage, you get to change your job to a 3rd job, which boosts your damage by a lot. And it's at this job that most builds are centered around, meaning at this time you'd want to start learning about your class and what it'll look like in the future. Level 100 is also when free stat and skill resets end, though they are still available for a price. Now, weirdly enough, researching for my future level was still difficult because there weren't a lot of updated guides on the character that I was playing or other jobs in the game. So I had a lot of trouble trying to find out what items I needed, what stats I should be focused on, and what skills I needed because I didn't know anything about the 3rd job at the time. Luckily, the players in the server are pretty nice and most people will help you out if you ask. There are even community-driven boosting sessions and even donation posts where people will mail you starter gear to help you on your journey. The IRO Discord also has a ton of helpful people, and if you simply ask, they will help you build your character and, well, just help you in general to what you need to do or where to go next on your leveling journey. In my hours of playing IRO, everyone was genuinely nice and helpful, which really went a long way to enjoying the game even more. Level 100 is also when you begin a long series of episodic story quests within the game. Now you can access certain story quests before even reaching this point, but those aren't presented to you at all, and you would need to use a wiki to find them. However, at level 100, most players will recommend that you start the episodic quest, the Royal Banquet quest, which, to my surprise, is an actual story quest in the game. They introduced unique characters, stakes, factions, and they're delivered in an interesting way with sort of in-game like cutscenes. You can see it in the screen right now. The story itself is also genuinely interesting and introduces a lot of the stories that occurred in the manhwa as memorial dungeons. They even introduce a lot of the lore in the game in those memorial dungeons as well, and in the Royal Banquet quest as well. They even introduce characters that'll play a big part in the quests to come, and they introduce the conflict that brings all these characters and yourself together. Now, while delivered in an interesting way, there is a whole lot of missing context here that most people probably wouldn't get, especially in the broader picture of the world, as a lot of it is tied to the in-game lore. Like, each family within the banquet does actually have interesting backgrounds if you research into it. So at the very least, there is this sense that if you want more of the story, you can actually research it yourself. I am genuinely surprised and glad that Gravity decided to do some story within the world of Ragnarok. And as mentioned before, you can also experience memorial dungeons, which are like quests that took place in the past. So within the manhwa story, the original story from 2 decades ago, so that you can experience the manhwa, some parts of the manhwa, through the game, which is pretty damn cool if I do say so myself. These quests also provide you with awesome actual rewards that will help you level up. In fact, these rewards are almost pivotal to being able to progress, as they're free and powerful items, and you probably wouldn't be able to progress without them. This is due to some levels having some sort of stat gate, where you need to have a certain level of power in order to be able to efficiently level up in those areas and kill the mobs in a decent amount of time. So basically, these quests are very important and interesting enough that they should be done. Speaking of progress, let's fast forward and progress to the end of the game of level 200 plus, or when you enter the 4th job. Now, while the 4th job does give you interesting skills, what's more important is that they unlock a new stat called talents. These are like your regular stats, but juiced up to high hell. Talents will increase your character's damage to levels beyond that any stat would do. Meaning at 200 plus, your character gets a massive boost to their damage and kinda trivializes anything that's below level 180 or something like that. Though this is needed as content above level 200 is very challenging, especially if you don't have good gear, and being able to gather that gear could take days to months of grinding for items to sell, and so that you can buy those gear from other players. Now, the reason for that is, well, we have to talk about it. Unfortunately, RO is currently pay to win, basically, as you can directly buy power with real world money. And the worst part is that a lot of those items are no longer found in the game. You can only get them through the cash shop, and in the worst form possible, because you can get them in gacha boxes, which are just terrible. However, you can play the game entirely free to play, as there is pretty much no soulbound or anything like that. So the whales or other players do sell the items that they get in the gacha, the cash shop, for in-game zenny. And it's actually not that hard to earn zenny in the game. It just takes a very long time and a lot of luck and a lot of patience. I will say though that if you get really lucky in the game, you could go from 0 to 100 really fast. Like, you get lucky with one MVP card and you could be essentially rich and set up for the rest of the game. But again, that's a 0.01% chance. But hunting MVPs is free. There are dailies that you can do that would allow you to solo MVPs. So it really is just patience and luck at the end of the day. Although I will say that RO is still a min-maxer's dream. Seeing the items you buy or craft increase your damage into the millions makes the monkey brain activate. It's just still so dope. Now, lastly, before we end this video, let's talk about the future of RO. International RO is currently at episode 18 of the story, while Korean RO is at episode 21. So there is still a slew of new content that has yet to arrive to the international version of RO. And based on Gravity's own financial report, they are still turning a pretty good profit, which means IRO is likely to continue. So everyone that still enjoys RO can still actually play RO long into the future, which thank God for that. Even for me, this was still an awesome slice of nostalgia, and I'm glad I'm still able to play this game in 2024. I'll probably continue to play it for a while as well. So if you used to play Ragnarok Online or have heard of this old game and want to try it, it's still here, which is pretty nice. But that's it for this video. If you've played Ragnarok Online before or are looking to play the game, I'd love to hear about your journey in the comments down below. And as always, thank you for watching.